Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 36th Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative webinar, which is part of our Applied Techniques webinar series. Our presenters today will be speaking about using drones in detection and mapping of Phragmites. I'm Elaine Ferrier from the Great Lakes Commission, and I'm hosting this webinar today with Samantha Tank, also from the Great Lakes Commission, on behalf of the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. The collaborative is a partnership to link people, information, and action on invasive Phragmites. We are coordinated jointly by the Great Lakes Commission and USGS Great Lakes Science Center through funding from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We aim to facilitate communication among stakeholders across the region, assist in the development of needed tools and programs, and serve as a resource center for information on Phragmites biology, management, and research. We are led by a diverse advisory committee and are organized according to the principles of collective impact. Check out the resources on our website, including management guidance and past webinars. Join our listserv to connect with hundreds of other Phrag professionals, and sign up for our weekly newsletter, which includes a monthly research roundup of academic papers published in the previous month, as well as a weekly newsletter. You can find links to join the newsletter and listserv on the front page of our website, greatlakesphragmites.net. You can also check out a new resource that we have on our website. It's a dynamic map of invasive species organizations. You can click on the county that you're interested in and see which organization is working on in your area. And you can find that link on the front page of our website as well. You can also consider participating in the Phragmites Adaptive Management Framework. This is a science-based program to learn from management successes around the Great Lakes Basin. You can receive customized guidance for your management areas with only a few enrollment steps, and also contribute to our collective knowledge on Phragmites management across the region. You can contact Samantha, our PAMF coordinator, at pamf@glc.org to learn more. Today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel and website. You can access an archive of past presentations on our website, and can also view and register for upcoming presentations by navigating to greatlakesphragmites.net/resources/webinars. And of course, connect with us on social media. We are at GLPhrag on Twitter and Facebook. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. We have Colin Brooks, who's an adjunct instructor in biological sciences at Michigan Tech Research Institute, and Charlotte Weinstein, assistant research scientist and geospatial programmer also at Michigan Tech Research Institute. Thanks so much, Charlotte and Colin, for taking the time to share your work with us today. And you can go ahead and take over control and begin presenting.
All right, I just want to confirm that you can hear us okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
All right, and I think you need to set up so you're sharing the screen with us.
Yes, let me just see here. Okay, you should see the pop-up to take over presenting now.
All right, and just to confirm, our screen is coming through okay?
It is, it looks great.
All right, thank you. Well, we'll go ahead and get started then. And thank you everybody for joining in today for the Finding Phrag While in Flight, Detecting and Mapping Invasive Phragmites Using Drones for Adaptive Management webinar. That my name is Colin Brooks, and then Charlotte Weinstein is here as well. So this was what we'll be presenting today is part of a larger project called Mapping and Monitoring of Invasive Phragmites in the Coastal Great Lakes using remote sensing data from multiple platforms that was funded by the USGS, US Geological Survey Great Lakes Science Center that is down the street from us here in Ann Arbor. And the leader for this project was Dr. Laura Bourgeau-Chavez. And we had a diverse team that contributed towards this project. So I mentioned we're in Ann Arbor. We are the Michigan Tech Research Institute, which is part of Michigan Tech University, all the way up there in Houghton. But we're a research center down here in Ann Arbor focused on a variety of technology applications to sense and understand both natural and man-made environments. Now, with this audience, we don't want to dwell for long on the invasive Phragmites itself. This community is quite well aware that we're talking about species that can form impenetrable stands that can be 15 feet high or higher, how it outcompetes native wetland plants, it alters fish habitat, recreational areas, changes beaches, And there's been a variety of research, and people have seen it for themselves in recent years, that shows invasion can be related to hydrologic alteration, shoreline development, and then there's been a fair amount of research on excess nutrients, making it easier for Phragmites to invade as well. So this project was completed in partnership with the Phragmites Adaptive Management Framework, or PAMF for short, that's run through the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. And in the PAMF program, land managers can enroll the property that they're managing and then provide information about that location. And through the Adaptive Management Framework, there are standardized monitoring protocols that help keep track of treatment outcomes and then implement standardized methods appropriate to that location as well. And the type of data on treatment methods and outcomes that is recorded is put into an adaptive management model to help provide site-specific management recommendations. And our specific role in this larger effort was to test and demonstrate how rapidly collected high-resolution unmanned aerial vehicle or drone collected imagery could be used in monitoring efforts. So as part of this project, we visited 20 sites during the summer of 2018 in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. Each of these sites, the land manager there had chosen to enroll in the PAMF program, and there was standardized data that was collected at each site, including vegetation characteristics such as species and density. We collected drone imagery and then also GPS points and field photos. And those data were important to help creating the final interpreted maps with vegetation classifications off the drone imagery. And on the right there, you can see the locations of the 20 sites enrolled in the PAMF program that we visited. Now, I've been working with UAVs or drones for a while, and I'm fairly familiar with airspace access issues. So we made sure that we checked the airspace at each of the potential sites that had been shared with us by the PAMF program. For example, in the red here, all of those sites were sites that were within restricted airspace near airports where people flying drones, either as hobbyists or as professionals, as we did in this project, cannot fly under ordinary FAA, Federal Aviation Administration rules. There actually are now procedures where you can sometimes get permission to fly within restricted airspace, but we did not pursue that for this project. And then also there are some properties like the National Wildlife Refuges where, according to FAA and National Park Service agreements, the specific permission is needed of the refuge manager or the park superintendent if it's a national park in order to fly there. So for this project, we primarily focused on the areas where it was easy to fly without additional further permission.
Now I'll walk through an overview of the methods that we used at each of these sites. This slide is a general representation of the workflow we used. I'll be going into greater detail into each of these 3 steps in future slides. But just to break it down, we started by collecting our data out in the field. This included a combination of both drone imagery and vegetation characteristics. Back at that lab, we brought all that data with us to process it and created 2 data products out of the drone imagery. The first one being an orthophoto, and what I mean by an orthophoto is a mosaicked image that's been georeferenced to the site's location. Some examples of those are on the lower left-hand corner of this slide, and also some digital surface models representing the elevation across the site. The final step was to use that drone imagery in tandem with our vegetation observations to create classifications of the maps, and some examples of those are on the lower right. So starting with data collection, we visited each of these 20 sites in the fields in summer of 2018. And while we were there, we filled out one of our standard wetland characterization field sheets seen on the right-hand side of this slide. And we used these field sheets to record information like ecosystem type. Many of these sites were emergent wetlands, which is not surprising. A couple of them were wet meadows as well. We recorded what species we saw at the site and how they were distributed across the site, whether they were patchy versus evenly mixed across the area. If there was Phragmites present, we made a note of that and noted if we saw any evidence of treatment. We also estimated percent covers, took GPS coordinates, and took a number of photos on the ground. An example of that is on the lower left. You can see it's been marked to indicate where and when that photo was taken. We also found it useful to bring with us a laminated copy of a base map. And while we were in the field, we drew notes on this map to record what we saw and where it was located in the site. And this was very useful for later image interpretation to produce our classifications. While we were collecting this vegetation information, we also flew a drone overhead. We used 2 different drones for this particular project. At most of our sites, we use the DJI Mavic Pro, a picture of which is on the lower left-hand corner of this slide. It's that little black one. At 2 of the sites, we used the Phantom 3 Advanced, which is in that little red circle in the middle bottom.
And one reason we wanted to use these was we wanted to understand if these less expensive systems could be practical for deployment and provide valuable information. In both cases, these were systems that cost between $1,000 and $1,500.
Yes. So both of these platforms were flown at 100 meters altitude, and we flew them using a flight path that was automatically programmed to make sure that each image had adequate overlap with the next image so that they could be mosaic together into a good quality ortho photo. The camera we used had a 12 megapixel resolution, and at 2 of these sites, we tested the use of a camera that could record near infrared imagery as well. Here's some examples of what those drone images looked like downloaded from the camera. On the left-hand side, you can see what we call an oblique image, meaning that this image was taken with the camera pointing at the site from an angle. And this is useful for getting a broad characterization of what the site looked like. On the right-hand side is an example of what we call a nadir image, meaning this was taken with the drone flying directly overhead, pointing straight down to the ground. And this is the type of image that we would use to mosaic together into our ortho photos. At any given site, we would take several dozen of these images at a time to stitch together. This image in particular is a good example of what Phragmites looks like from the air. It has a characteristic bluish green color to it, and also has a very noticeable texture. This bright green stuff in the image is lemna, or duckweed, which is a floating aquatic vegetation. Some more examples from a different site. Again, on the left-hand side is an oblique image taken at an angle. On the right-hand side is another nadir image pointing directly down. And it's interesting to note that this is a very different site. This dark green vegetation along here is all typha or cattail. And this brown vegetation here is all vegetation that's dead, possibly due to treatment. And in this case, this is a mix of both dead Phragmites and dead typha. So once all of our imagery had been collected, we brought it back to the lab to process it. And we processed all of this using a program called Agisoft. Along the bottom of this slide are some screen captures of what that process looked like. Using this program, we aligned the images to create an overview ortho photo mosaic. And again, what I mean by an ortho photo is a merged composite image that's been georeferenced to that location of the site. And these ortho photos had an output resolution of 3 centimeters. In addition, we also generated a digital surface model of elevation across the site. On the lower right-hand side of this slide is what that looks like. It's important to note that this is the surface elevation of the site, not the ground elevation. The cameras we use take optical imagery. They're unable to penetrate tree cover. So for example, the red and orange blobs on the right side of this digital surface model are trees. It's the height of the tree in that image. And these digital surface models had a resolution of 13 centimeters. The third step was to take those data products and turn them into classifications. And to do that, we used an object-based classification process using eCognition, which is a software program produced by Trimble. You might know their name based on their high-performance GPS units. These screenshots represent the general workflow we used in eCognition. Starting on the upper left-hand side, we loaded the orthophoto into eCognition. Then on the upper right, we performed a process called image segmentation. And what this does is the program will look at all the pixels in the image and group them together into clusters so that pixels that are very similar to each other are grouped together in larger, what we call objects. And these are then treated as a homogeneous feature to make the classification process more efficient. And this is a commonly used technique in image analysis, especially for high resolution imagery like our drone images. After that, we drew what are called training samples to inform our classification. And the purpose of a training sample is to provide the algorithm with a good example of what a particular land cover class will look like. So for example, in our screenshot on the bottom left, this purple splotch here is a training sample to demonstrate what Phragmites looks like in this particular image. This bright green splotch here is a training sample for lemna or duckweed. And the final step was to plug in those training samples and run a classification algorithm. And in the output, eCognition then extrapolates to the rest of the image to classify what's Phragmites versus lemna in this particular example. It's worth noting that the classification process can be somewhat iterative. And for this particular project, we use the nearest neighbor algorithm, which is built into eCognition and is a relatively simple type of machine learning. The metrics we used for this classification included mean pixel values for each band of the camera, something called the visible atmospherically resistant index, or VARI, which was useful for our red, green, blue imagery, positional information based on the particular site characteristics, and a variety of other parameters. And just to reiterate, the output is intended to be used as a way to quantify Phragmites cover to evaluate treatment effectiveness. A little more detail on how we produce these classifications. As I mentioned, the visible atmospherically resistant index, or VARI, was particularly useful for us. It involves some simple arithmetic by adding and subtracting the pixel values of the red, green, and blue bands. It was also often useful to take into account certain site-specific parameters. For example, if a site had a road that lined the eastern edge of an image, it was often useful to plug that into our machine learning algorithm by taking into account distance from that edge. One other technique that was useful was to create more classes than we needed for our purposes. For example, we use this often with water. You can see in this bottom left screenshot here, there's clear open water, but then there's also these wave caps or foam. These are all water to us, but to the machine learning algorithm, those pixels can look very spectrally different. So it was often useful to classify those separately into open water versus a white cap or foam class. And then in the final output, we would merge those together into a single water class. As with any study, we wanted to make sure we had a method to evaluate accuracy and make sure we are producing valid outputs. So in order to do this, we started by grouping our classes into 4 key categories. The first 2 categories were live Phragmites and dead Phragmites, since those are the focus of this study. Any other vegetation, such as trees or shrubs, were grouped together into an other vegetation class. And then anything else that's not vegetation, such as water or pavement, was grouped together into a 4th class. For each of these classes, we randomly generated a statistically significant number of test points scattered across the site. An example of that is in the image on the right-hand side of this slide. And at each of these points, we would take a look at the classification output, compare it with the original image, and evaluate whether that classification was correct. And that was done based on visual image interpretation informed by our field data. And using this method, we determined that across all 4 of these classes for all 20 of our sites, on average, we achieved a mean accuracy of 92.3%. An error matrix is a tool that's commonly used in remote sensing studies like this to evaluate accuracy. It's worth noting that there are multiple ways of assessing accuracy. There's overall accuracy, but there's also user's accuracy, which is from the perspective of the person who would be looking at the final map. And there's also producer's accuracy, which is from the perspective of the person making the map. These different types of accuracy can be and often are different from each other, so it's useful to break it down and evaluate from these different perspectives. Here's another example of an error matrix from another site, just showing that these different accuracies can vary between sites and perspectives.
So those are our methods, and we wanted to show some examples of the different results we were able to get using the drone-assisted mapping. And we ended up having what we called different types of sites. And Site 65 is an example of a larger site with treatment that's visible in the imagery, and can be and seem to be an ideal type of site where drone imagery could help quantify that area of treatment. And then here's an example of the classification that results from analyzing the red, green, blue imagery, and we could do it into more specific classes when they're available, and then summarize them into the live and dead Phragmites. And then we created both of these outputs, and then a summary output. Go back one. And then a summary output where we had all the outputs of the imagery with the PAMF polygon, and by that I mean the treatment area that was enrolled in the PAMF program, and that boundary was shared with us. And then it could also see the digital surface model and then the classification result. And then this third map here, the one with the 4 panes on it, was shared with each of the land managers. And then if we zoom into the lower corner here, you can see the standardized reporting we were doing. In this case, we saw no live Phragmites when interpreting the aerial photography, but 38.2% of the area, or about 37,000 square feet, appeared to be dead Phragmites based upon the aerial imagery interpretation and field data. And that's the type of quantitative information we were trying to create through this effort. Here's another type of site, a very small site where treatment did appear to have occurred. I said the areas enrolled in the Phragmites Adaptive Management Framework program were shared with us, and in this case, this particular landowner chose to enroll a very small area. You can see this is only a few meters across. Looks like it's about 10 meters across there. And so our job was to understand what we can map even within some of these very small sites. And then here's the classification, the results from it. Primarily dead vegetation, and then some areas of still live cattail as well. And then here we have the output product that was shared with the landowner, including the elevation data, a larger inset map that showed the location of the enrolled area within a larger context of our aerial photography, and then existing imagery available through things like Esri ArcGIS or Google Earth, and the classification result, and this was shared with the landowner. And then zooming in here, we saw that about 93.3% or 1,400 square feet of the area was dead vegetation, and this included dead Phragmites. Now, another type of site that we hadn't necessarily anticipated to start with was some coastal sites where at the time of enrollment, the property manager, the land manager, wanted to track their Phragmites there, but by the time we came along and flew it in the summer of 2018, in this case, due to rising lake levels, the environment where the Phragmites had been occurring had changed significantly. In this case, half of it was now underwater, and part of, I believe, in Lake Michigan in this case, and then the rest of it was now beach. And so we can't know for sure whether, for example, the fact that that's now sand there is a result of previous treatment, but we can at least show what that enrolled area looks like now with the updated aerial photography. And in that case, the classification isn't very interesting because most of it's sand and water, but we still wanted to capture these sites. And then there's the output product that could be shared with the land manager. And in this case, none of it was live or dead Phragmites. And here's another very different site. At first, and we see questions. Popping up, and what we would like to do is, if it's okay with people, is those questions are showing up in the chat window, is then return to them at the end of the presentation, if that'll work for folks. Okay. For example, I just saw the question pop up about ground control, and I'd like to return to that. So. Okay, this site here, we were puzzled a bit by the polygon that we were being asked to image until we looked at the historical imagery. Here's the classification result again, mostly sand. And here's the output product, and so we saw no live or dead Phragmites. So what we did is we looked through Google Earth to look through historical imagery. And had that imagery available as georeference. So here's what the site looked like in 1998, where it was primarily open water. By 2005, it had changed significantly and was a wetland area with vegetation. Here it is in 2006, and 2011. And 2014 here, this is right at the point when right as the lake levels were about to start rising. And here we are in 2016. The beach is retreating here and has covered the Phragmites treatment area that we were being asked to image. And in 2018, the water has come up even more, and the site is almost at the water's edge. So here, we were capturing that none of this is Phragmites anymore, but this does not appear to be looking at that necessarily from treatment, but really more due to the dynamic nature of water levels in the Great Lakes. Here's a type of site where our UAV imagery was not useful. This is a site that was enrolled. We could tell from our field work that there was Phragmites underneath, but again, we're using aerial imagery. We can only see what you can see from the air, and with the Phragmites underneath the tree canopy, we can't image that. And so when you classify it, it all shows up as trees and sand. So it's not the type of site we would recommend using this for. And as I said, none of it came out as Phragmites because we couldn't see it. And then this is another type of site that had been enrolled. This is a very small site, again, just a few yards across. Although it was enrolled, no treatment appears to have occurred here. I see the question about drone transects. Well, we'll come back to that one too. But in this case, the polygon we were given didn't seem to reflect the on-the-ground area. So in order to reflect what we thought was being attempted to be monitored here, we did move the polygon some. This is also one of the sites where we're able to fly our near-infrared camera as well. And in this case, in the classification, most of this polygon that we thought was being trying to attract here was still live Phragmites. You can see in the classification there. And there's the output product that was shared with the land manager. And in this case, we saw that 76% of the area was still live Phragmites, or about 927 square feet. So I said we did do a small demonstration with a near-infrared camera. This was one that was sensitive to green, red, and near-infrared light, so beyond what's visible with the human eye. We had access to a small $300 near-infrared MapIR camera. That's the brand of it. And not a high-end system, but part of what we're trying to understand is if a low-cost system like this could add value that could be deployed from a small drone. In this case, we flew this one with the Phantom 3 Advanced, which when we bought it was about $1,200, but they can be bought for about $700 now. And we did the classification here twice, once with just the red, green, blue imagery, and a second time using the near-infrared imagery. And in this case, we had similar accuracy results. For one of our sites we had identical accuracy results. And in the second site where we had access to this camera, which is mostly being used for other work that summer, we came up with just a couple percentage points higher when adding the color infrared data as well. And here's the other site where we were able to deploy the color infrared. The middle is the color infrared, where you can see that, when you're using near infrared data, vegetation tends to show up with a reddish color when it's green and growing, and you can see that there.
So this table here summarizes the accuracy results across all 20 of our sites, focusing on the user and producer accuracy for live and dead Phragmites, since this is the focus of this project. Overall, you can see that on the whole, our outputs did a pretty good job. These are some summary statistics based on the information I just showed you in that table. Overall, across all 4 of our classes for our 20 sites, the mean and median accuracy hovered at about 92%. The average live Phragmites users and producers accuracy were both about 90%. And for dead Phragmites, the accuracy was a bit lower. Users' accuracy was 76.53% and producers' accuracy was 85.23%. And one potential explanation for this is that dead Phragmites can often look very similar to other dead vegetation. You might recall in that nadir image I showed you earlier in this presentation, the dead vegetation was a mixture of both dead Phragmites and dead typha. So they can be quite difficult to distinguish from each other visually from an image like that. Within the context of adaptive management, we see the use of drones being most useful for the assessment and monitoring parts of the adaptive management cycle. In an ideal world, we think it would be quite useful to first fly imagery of a site before applying treatment to establish some baseline measurements of what the site looks like. Then the land manager would apply treatments and management as they normally would. And after a period of time for those treatments to take effect, they would fly again to collect new imagery and compare it with that initial baseline to help with evaluating whether that strategy was effective and inform their future decision making. And this process could be repeated multiple times throughout the adaptive management cycle.
All right, and we've been using unmanned air vehicles or drones for quite a while here. And there are several considerations that we're recommending when implementing drones into adaptive management and monitoring. One is whether or not the site is of a sufficient size to make drone sensing worthwhile to get that overhead view. We found it most useful for the larger sites that were shared with us that were larger than an acre. Just as a side note, we have used this to look at some very large Phragmites treatment areas, and we've been able to get areas in the 40 to 80 acre range in a single 15 to 20 minute drone flight before flying at our standard 100 meter or 320 foot height that we found useful. So that gives you some idea of what an area you could get in a single flight as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, drones are just not at least these levels of systems are just not useful for looking when your sites that have a lot of tree cover and you can't see the Phragmites underneath. And as Charlotte mentioned, we flew these sites after they had been enrolled in the PAMF program, but we would have liked to have been able to collect the imagery from before and then after treatment to compare changes over time. And in the earlier list of sites, I showed, for example, the sites that were in red that we were unable to fly at due to airspace restrictions. It is important when flying sites to follow FAA regulations, and the primary one that would be impact people there is proximity to airports, or at least it impact us when we were trying to visit sites. And there are startup requirements and costs and steps in order to use drones. There's always options to work with people that are already flying them, but the systems that we flew, like I said, were in the $1,000 to $1,500 range. all of our people flying drones have passed their FAA unmanned pilot test to get their unmanned pilot certificates, which is good for 2 years. And then there are data processing steps as well. So that's the content we wanted to share today. That's our contact information, and thank you for this opportunity. But we've seen that a large number of questions have come across. So if we can exit presentation mode here and bring up the chat window, then we can start answering the questions that people have been asking. So let's see, and let's scroll back. Let's see if we can scroll back to the first one there. All right. So we saw a question about whether any of our sites included both native and non-native Phragmites. I believe all of these sites were non-native Phragmites invaded, and that's why they have been enrolled in the program. I don't think we saw any native Phragmites in these sites.
Yeah, not that I can recall.
Yeah. All right. Question there on the image processing part on whether or not we use ground control points to orthorectify your imagery. In this case, we didn't. We wanted this to be a fast and relatively easy process. Ground control is very helpful in terms of improving the positional accuracy of your output products. Without ground control, you're probably up to plus or minus 10 feet in terms of the positional accuracy of your imagery, which again, if you're doing a very tiny site, could impact the accuracy results. So ground control takes additional time in terms of recording high quality GPS coordinates at those ground control points. So we felt, especially for the larger sites over an acre, that we demonstrated we could get useful results without having to do dedicated ground control. A question there about using the digital surface model elevation data. We did actually use that for classification because the height of the vegetation could be a factor for differentiating Phragmites from other vegetation.
I'll just add to that the DSM had variable usefulness to us in sites where a lot of the vegetation was a similar height. It didn't do a whole lot in distinguishing those cover types, but where there were drastic differences, such as distinguishing tree cover from other classes, it was useful for that.
And then there's another question about automating our drone transects. There are several programs you can use for that. We've used the PixHawk mapping program. We've used Drone Deploy, and we've used Pix4D Mapper as well. And there are some open source alternatives as well, but all three of those are developed by companies that want you to then go upload your data to the cloud afterward for them to process for a fee. Now, we had the software here in order to create those orthophoto products, so we didn't have to go through that. There's a question there about being able to distinguish between Phragmites in standing water versus dry ground.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
That's certainly something you could do based on visual image interpretation. We haven't necessarily tried distinguishing between where the Phragmites is growing using the machine learning algorithm. I think it would be something we would need to test before.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about this in theory. I mean, if the Phragmites and if some of that standing water was visible, and then maybe that could help indicate with Phragmites was a standing water, or if the Phrag looked different or was a different, maybe a different elevation on the dry ground. It's probably possible, but yes, we should really test it before making a definitive statement.
With object-based image analysis too, you can ask the algorithm to take into account contextual information. Yeah. So if the Phragmites objects were surrounded by water objects, that could potentially
that's a good point.
Help with that.
So there's a question there about how did we determine the altitude that we selected. We actually did do a bunch of testing at different altitudes. We tested in the tens of meters, and then the standard FAA height limit is 400 feet, which is the same thing as 122 meters. And what we found is in order to have a good pixel size on the ground and be able to create the overlapping images necessary to create the orthophotos on 3D data, we found that that height of 100 meters or about 320 feet was the most reliable height. So telling our field data collectors to fly at that height created a standard output product that seemed useful. There was a question there about tree cover. Would a flight in the fall after the leaves are off work to capture frag under deciduous stands before stems die off? Potentially so. It would depend on how thick the branch cover was. Some places, even after the leaves fall off, the branches are thick enough that it's hard to see what's underneath. But we have seen, Phragmites stay green into November before during our field work. So it's a possibility. And good to know that others are also looking into this, including work from the Michigan Natural Features Inventory and the Michigan Aerospace Corporation, and we'll check out that technical report. Thank you for sharing that. A question about processing time there. How long does it take to stitch images together and then running the algorithms? So these areas are fairly small, and we can stitch the images together in less than an hour, actually less than half an hour, and even the largest of the sites we did. When we've done some of the 40 to 80 acre sites, those can take a couple of hours. It really depends on what kind of CPU resources you throw at it, and then there is the option to have companies process it online if it's fairly standard imagery as well. And then the image interpretation algorithms, I mean, there's some training there and selection and then running through recognition. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I would say that depends a lot on the type of site we're looking at. Larger sites take longer for recognition to process, so there's that time consideration. Also, more complex sites will take longer than more simple sites. So for example, our beach sites were very fast because it was all sand and water. But when you're dealing with a site that has a lot of different types of vegetation, it can take several tries to get it to an acceptable output. So it's kind of hard to place a good constraint on how long that would take.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a dedicated person to doing, for example, just the classification and the sites aren't that complicated, we could probably crank out a couple sites a day. But again, there's a large amount of variation in there. So a question there is, yeah, we've heard about in Canada about only being able to use herbicide on dry ground. So it would be, I think, interesting to look at that. I've been to Canada and seen Phragmites growing on dry ground, so maybe we could think about that some more. And yes, I'm always happy to chat with people about their work as well. The world of people doing drone and Phragmites mapping research is not that large yet, although we think there's some useful tools here, so we're happy to talk to people. Any more questions? So I think that's all the questions we have at this point. Oh, no, there are more. Okay, sorry, I missed that. Do you want to answer?
Sure. So the question's about how the difference in density of Phragmites affects the outcome of classification. I would say that when the Phragmites was growing more densely, that actually made it easier to classify because those segments could be larger and would be less heterogeneous between them. So I think it affected the ease of classification. I think we were still able to control for that kind of thing through our QA/QC process. The main influence was how easy the process ended up being for us.
I see a question there about the drones we use being relatively low cost, which was on purpose. We wanted this to be relatively easy to deploy. The question is about whether or not we had any limitations in performance that would make us consider investing in a more expensive system. And we do have some more expensive systems. We have several larger multi-rotor systems, hexacopter and octocopter, so 6 and 8 bladed systems that can deploy up to about 5 kilograms, so up to about 10 pounds. And the primary limit, I mean, there are really two primary limitations. One is flight time. So all our drones are limited to about 20, maximum 25 minutes of flight time. We've seen some systems costing, and I'm talking multi-rotors here, as opposed to fixed wing, which is another option. We've seen some systems costing in the $30,000 to $50,000 range where you can fly for an hour or an hour and a quarter, but those are harder to deploy on a practical basis because they're harder to afford, frankly. And then the other limitation is, you know, the near infrared sensor that we tested was size of a GoPro, and so it's not a very high-end near infrared system. I would have liked to have deployed a higher-end multispectral camera to get a more definitive statement about the usefulness of near infrared and red edge imagery. And so that would have required one of our larger systems. We do actually have a multispectral, 6-band multispectral camera that can be tuned to different wavelengths that would be good to deploy over Phragmites if we can find an opportunity to do so. So a suggestion there about using the near infrared data to help differentiate between inundated and non-inundated stands of Phrag. Yeah, it could potentially help there. The key there is whether or not you can see the water that in the inundated areas of Phragmites. We've seen areas of Phragmites so dense that it, especially before senescence starts occurring, it's actually hard to see the water underneath the Phragmites, although sometimes you can. So if you can at least to see some of the water, the near infrared, because it doesn't penetrate very far into the water, really helps bring that out more obviously. So that could have helped potentially with stratifying the Phragmites stands. Again, something that that would be worth investigating, and maybe we could collaborate with people on. Yes, and a comment there about Dr. Pat Chow-Fraser McMaster. Yes, I am familiar with Dr. Chow-Fraser's work. I've had the opportunity to chat with her at several IAGLR conferences, including the one that was hosted at McMaster. And then I've also worked with her most recent PhD student on wetlands mapping work in Phragmites. So thank you for that recommendation, and I do recommend other people check out Dr. Pat Chow-Fraser's work as well.
I think that's it.
But we'll hang around here for a few more minutes in case any more questions come through. But if not, then Elaine, if you want to take back control, that's okay with us too.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you everybody for the great questions. I'd suggest maybe, unless a couple more come in right away, maybe just reach out to Colin and Charlotte directly with emails that are on the screen there. We have a couple more questions. Yep. Did you want to pick those back up, Colin?
We have written a technical report for the USGS on this, and then we're also partway through writing a peer-reviewed paper to come out hopefully next year when we finalize it.
Great, and last call for questions.
We can follow up with this message community on access to our reporting results.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much again for the presentation, and thanks all for the great questions. We have been recording the presentation, so I will upload it to our website and YouTube channel and send out a note to the listserv as soon as that's available. And really great, interesting work. There's a lot of exciting things happening with drones, so I hope others will pick up and also do some drone monitoring and maybe involve your programs with PAMP as well, as Colin and Charlotte have. So thanks again so much, and I hope everyone has a fantastic day.
All right, thank you everybody for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.